We're discussing the issue of water as it affects the entire Colorado River Basin. That's coming up on the next Nevada Week.
Support for Nevada Week is provided by Senator William H. Hernstadt, Cashman Equipment, De Castro Verde Law Group, Nevada State Bank, Valley Electric Association, and additional supporting sponsors.
Welcome as always to Nevada Week. I'm Kip Ortenberger and thank you for joining us. Well, we all know the plight of water here in Nevada, but what about outside our state? Supply and demand is a shared issue, and as an example of this, we're finalizing a multi-state drought contingency plan to address it. Now, if we don't finalize this plan, we're on the eve of the federal government stepping in and making restrictions. So no matter who is making the decisions, what affects everyone affects us. So what we want to do on the show today is go outside Nevada Week's typical focus of just Nevada and look more collectively at the issues as they affect all of us on the Colorado River. Our objectives here are to get a better holistic understanding of the needs, the realities we confront, and what solutions may be. To help with this, please welcome Patricia Mulroy, Senior Fellow of Climate Adaptation and Environmental Policy at the William Boyd School of Law at UNLV, and the former longtime General Manager of the Las Vegas Valley Water District and Southern Nevada Water Authority. We also have Daniel Rothberg, Environmental Reporter for the Nevada Independent, Bill Hasenkamp, Manager of the Colorado River Resources at the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, and finally, Colby Pellegrino, Director of Water Resources at the Southern Nevada Water Authority. Thank you so much all for being here. We really appreciate it. Daniel,
thanks for having me.
I would like to start with you. Can you just give us an idea of what water do we have available? What is our supply?
So the Colorado River is split into two divisions. There's an upper basin, the states of Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah, and there's a lower division, the lower basin of Arizona, Nevada, and California. And to answer your question, basically there are more rights to water on the Colorado River than there's actual water to go around. When the Colorado River was divvied up in the 1920s, the negotiators used a period of record that was particularly wet, looking at sort of the 1,000-year larger record. As a result, they estimated that the Colorado River had a lot more water than it actually did. The unit that they use on the Colorado River and across the West is an acre foot to sort of talk about water. It's the amount of water that can fill an acre up to about 1 foot. And they essentially estimated that this river, by the 1940s, they'd allocated about 17.5 million acre feet of rights to the Colorado River. But the fact is that in most years, if we're lucky, the Colorado River stream flow is about 15 million acre feet. And
and that's not from the first year that we recorded. You're saying that's what our average has been?
That's what our average has been over about the last 100 years, since sort of 1922 in the compact. But the issue that we're facing now is in the past 20 years, during this sort of last really bad drought since 2000, the stream flow has been even smaller than that, about 13 million acre feet on average. So the result is that there really is not enough water to fill the obligations and the entitlements that the different states have. And that's sort of at the base of the problem.
Let's talk about those obligations. Colby, how much, when we look at then demand and usage, how much are we actually using? What is the allocation that we have?
So the way the water is allocated generally is there's 7.5 million acre feet allocated to the upper basin, 7.5 to the lower basin, and 1.5 million to Mexico. The lower basin and Mexico have been consistently using pretty much their full apportionment for several decades. The upper basin's use, on the other hand, kind of floats between 3.5 and 4.5 million acre feet a year. That use generally, when you look across the entire basin, is about 70% agriculture, the other 30% municipal.
Pat, we already mentioned it. We're in a drought. Last 20 years have been extremely difficult. When we're looking, especially at our reservoirs, a lot of people say that they're kind of the barometer on where we are with our water. What can Lake Mead tell us about where we are and where we are with supply and demand?
Well, Lake Mead is the last storage reservoir in the system to take the hit, so it is a great indicator of how strained the system is. There's an intricate formula on how much water is released from Lake Powell to Lake Mead, but from a Lake Mead perspective, we have had some seriously dry years. And it's not just a matter of overallocation, let's be perfectly frank. I think we're in a much drier century than we were in the 20th century, and climate change is taking its toll on this river system.
Bill, we hear the term hot drought is the type of drought we're in. First off, what is a hot drought? How's that different from just a regular drought?
Yeah, Kib, so it's a bit ironic to be talking about a hot drought when we're expecting snow in Las Vegas this week. But that's exactly what this is. It's a heat-driven drought. A recent scientific study looked at 3 long-term trends on the Colorado River. They looked at the last 100 years and noticed that the flow in the rivers have been dropping steadily over the last 100 years, but the precipitation that they looked at has been about even. And the third thing they looked at was temperatures have been increasing over the last 100 years. So the conclusion of the study was we're getting the same amount of snow today as we did historically, but it's melting earlier. And spring comes about 3 weeks earlier now than it used to. And why that matters is because as the snow melts early, you have hundreds of square miles of plants that come out early, intercept the water, soak that water up, and that keeps the water from flowing into Lake Mead. So the warmer it gets, even if we get the same amount of snow, the less water will end up in Lake Mead.
And the other part of that that's sometimes difficult for customers to understand is there's an event called sublimation. And that's if it gets really warm very quickly, the winds pick up, and snow goes straight from solid to gas. It never turns into water, it just evaporates.
So when we're talking about this drought and we're talking about a higher increase in demand, and we're also talking about maybe miscalculating what the original amount of water we have terms of kind of catastrophic proportions of where we are. Pat, are we at a catastrophic level of where we are as far as climate change and our demand on the river?
No, I wouldn't use the term catastrophic. What I would describe it as is we are at a crossroads where we definitely have to sit up and take notice, and we have to act now. We can't wait for the catastrophe to happen, because in all candor, Kip, if you get to the point of catastrophe, it's too late. You have to take your actions before that moment hits, before Lake Mead has so little water in it that nothing goes downstream, that there's no water going to California, Arizona, or Mexico, and that southern Nevada's supply is being threatened. So the time to act is now, just as the Drought Conservation Plan intends.
Lake Mead is currently at 38% capacity, Lake Powell at 45%. Do you think we can make the right measures to get back to where we could see full capacity of both lakes again?
I have always been a perennial optimist, and I've watched the states spar with one another. I've watched them sue one another, but I've also watched them evolve from the 90s into a group of essentially partners that recognize that their joint survival depends on each other, and that they don't have time to go to court. They don't have time for polemics and big political speeches. The time to act is now. And so I have watched them every time as we have progressed into this state of dryness, make the necessary moves in order to prevent a disaster from happening.
Let's talk about those necessary moves, Daniel. We are currently trying to get an entire contingency plan across both the upper and the lower basin. Where are we at on the contingency plan? Who do we still need to have sign off on that?
So the upper basin has signed off on their version of the contingency plan. And it's the sort of formal term is a drought contingency plan. The lower basin, Nevada was the first state to approve the drought contingency plan. In the lower basin, We're still waiting on Arizona to sort of settle its internal drought contingency plan and to kind of take it to the finish line. In the lower basin, the way it works is that as Lake Mead drops lower and lower below 1075 feet above sea level, each state would have to take a certain amount of cuts to its allocation, building off of past agreements where they would sort of adding to the amount of cuts that they would have to take according to past agreements.
Bill, California has not signed off on, what's limiting California from being signed on to the contingency plan?
Yeah, so agencies in California have been working hard over the last 4 years to get this plan done. We've done a lot of selling within California. California has a higher right to the river than Arizona and Nevada, so it took some convincing of California of why this is a good deal. And we got very close to an agreement, but there's been one issue that is in California unresolved by some agencies, and it's the same issue we had back in 2003 when California cut back its use, and that is impacts to the Salton Sea. So when California agriculture agencies use less water, there's less inflow to the Salton Sea, which is a key stop on the migratory bird path, as well as the concern is if the sea were to drop, there would be dust that would blow off the lake bed and impact the quality of life in that area. We dealt with it back in 2003. The state came up, the state of California, solved that problem. But today, for the drought plan, certain districts are concerned that by participating in this, there could be problems with the Salton Sea. So we have changed the plan that we think addresses the Salton Sea impacts, and we're hopeful that we can get our agencies across the line. Metropolitan's board has approved it. Whether we can get the agricultural agencies across remains to be seen, but it's clear that the Salton Sea is once again a key factor in protecting Lake Mead.
But I think it's important that Nevadans realize that the important agency in Southern California is Metropolitan. You're being awful humble. The rest can participate or they can't participate. But the key agency that has to be a part of the solution is Metropolitan. They stepped up early and they stepped up aggressively. So when you say California hasn't come to the table, I'm going to push back a little and say that the critical agency in Southern California has stepped up.
And so do we think that we will be able to get all of California and the Metropolitan signed off on by March 6th when the deadline is for the Federal Bureau?
Well, the deadline isn't to sign the agreements. The deadline is to get approvals. And so we are optimistic that we will get there.
Colby, in southern Nevada, once the contingency plan is in place, how do you think that will affect the normal resident that we have in southern Nevada?
Well, if we've done our job well, it really shouldn't. The drought contingency plan, by and large, is a positive thing for southern Nevada. It gives us the opportunity to store our water at a lower cost in Lake Mead. It gives us access to more stored resources for the future. But the fact of the matter is we're in a drought. And we do need to keep conserving in this community. And that's probably the biggest message that you'll see as the drought progresses is we need to keep conserving. If you were born the year this drought started, you graduated high school this year, and we've been in a drought your entire life.
That's scary.
And that message is in some places, people have gotten complacent about that because we have been in a drought for so long, and we really have to reinvigorate some of that conservation ethic that we were really good at and get back there as a community.
Pat, one of the things you talk a lot about is a holistic approach here, especially, and let's talk about Southern Nevada and having that individual that's potentially been involved in a drought their entire lives. How do we get a better understanding of what the entire Colorado River Basin is dealing with here? And let's just start with agriculture. How do we get a better understanding of what the needs are of agriculture when we're talking about water conservation?
Well, agriculture obviously has to play its part. I mean, I think the critical message, whether you're in the upper basin or in the lower basin, conservation is part of your tomorrow reality. It's part of today and it will be part of tomorrow. I said earlier we're in a much drier century, And so agriculture has any number of opportunities through rotational fallowing, through changing out the crops that they grow, that they can stay a vibrant agricultural community and still become a part of the solution. And I think you're increasingly seeing dialogue around that happening in agricultural communities. But obviously, none of these communities want to be wiped off the face of the map, right? And who can blame them? I mean, you've got generation after generation after generation that has built its livelihood around this agricultural community. And we in the United States have been beneficiaries of it. I mean, some of these districts that Bill was talking about are 11% of our winter fruits and vegetables. We import a tremendous amount of agriculture in the winter, also out of Mexico. So it's part of our diet and it's part of our food supply, but there are ways in which the agricultural community can and is participating. Look at the fallowing that's going on with Palo Verde and Metropolitan. There has been an enormous amount of cooperation there. There's also a program with the Imperial Irrigation District. Both of those agencies have stepped up and have become a part of the solution.
Well, let's talk about that. So the Imperial Irrigation District, Colby mentioned before that 75% of the water is being used for irrigation and agriculture. What are some of the solutions we have within that district, say, to really reduce the percentage of water that we have?
Yeah, so we've already partnered with, as Pat said, both with Palo Verde Irrigation District and Imperial Irrigation District to reduce their use. So in IID, we fund conservation measures. We pay for putting in sprinklers. We pay for lining ditches. We pay for pump recovery systems to recapture water. And the saved water then is made available to Southern California to meet our needs. In the Palo Verde Valley, we pay farmers not to grow crops on a rotating basis. And so we pay them more than they would make by farming on a voluntary basis to take land out of production for a period of time. And again, the saved water comes to Southern California to meet our needs.
Kip, there's one thing I think people need to understand, because Colby's absolutely right. Agriculture does use 75% of all the water, but 75% of all the water globally is used for agriculture. We as human beings have invested 3/4 of the available fresh water supply of the planet to grow the necessary food supply for human beings. Let's be very frank about that.
And with that said, Daniel, I want to throw it over to you. What are some solutions if we're at 75% and that is the norm, if we were to reduce it just by 5%, that is a significant amount of water. I'm not a mathematician, but I can just imagine that's millions and millions of acre feet. What are some of the solutions that are going on within the U.S. or maybe internationally that we can potentially employ here to reduce our water usage?
Well, I think some of them have been mentioned, switching over from flood irrigation to drip irrigation, crop switching, rotational fallowing. But I think that there have been I think that there have been improvements not just in agriculture, but we really haven't talked that much about municipal water supply. And Colby talked a little bit about conservation, but our appliances are more efficient. As new homes come online, we're just using less water because our appliances are more efficient. And it's sort of incredible the extent to which that has affected things in general. But, I think some of the solutions have been mentioned with agriculture. We talked about sort of drip irrigation, rotational fallowing, and crop switching, and thinking about just sort of the incentives. I think that there needs to be some sort of incentive and incentive-based solution. People are going to respond. People are smart in the agricultural business. They're going to respond to incentives and weigh all of their different options. But I think just saying people shouldn't grow alfalfa or putting sort of a cap on it like that is probably not the way to go.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Please, Colby.
The one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. But one of those things that happened on the Colorado River Basin that was really successful was called the Pilot System Conservation Program. And that was basically a grant application for any water user to say, I have a project which I think is going to save water, but I need money to do it. Southern Nevada Water Authority, Metropolitan Water District, Central Arizona Water Conservation District, and Denver Water all funded that with the Bureau of Reclamation. And we had an overwhelming success success. We always had more applications than we did funding available, and we put a serious amount of water in Lake Mead as the result of doing just that. And it was all of these things that Daniel had mentioned: rotational fallowing, choosing to store your water in a different place if you weren't using it. It was very successful. So there's still, in some ways, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit if there's funding available.
But I think you went right to the big issue, which is what are some of the longer-term solutions? And the longer-term solutions, let's be frank, they have to include augmenting the supply. If you have a structural deficit right out of the gate because the science of 1920 wasn't as sophisticated as it is today, and more water was given away then, and then again in the 40s with the Mexican Treaty, we have, as we're having a conversation about everyone in the basin tightening their belt, everyone looking at ways of being more efficient, that alone is not going to solve the problem. So when I did a lot of work with the World Economic Forum. So when you look at areas like Israel, you look at Singapore, you look at China, you start seeing some real innovative future supplies. You see a tremendous amount of ocean desalting. Israel's got its entire future water supply predicated on increased ocean desalting. The time for us to begin to have serious dialogue to bring that into the equation of solving the longer-term solution, that's now. We've got to start having those conversations.
And when you say augmenting, you mentioned desal. Are there other forms of technology that we can employ? I know just recently we've had a couple articles about the cloud seeding as being something we could use too. Are these available to us?
Absolutely. We've been doing cloud seeding, as I know Metropolitan has. Colby can speak to it. We'd been doing it in partnership when I was there with the Desert Research Institute. The problem with cloud seeding is you have to have clouds. Let's start right there. So when the clouds are around, yes, cloud seeding can increase, correct me if I'm wrong, about 15% of the precipitation that will come down in any given storm event. But you have to have the storm event.
Which is not going to happen in Nevada very often, that's for sure. Pat, and I want to ask the entire panel this, but Pat, you speak of a mosaic that when we talk about strategies, we're not just talking about one strategy, we're talking about multiple strategies together. You know, we've talked a little bit about municipality and how we as individuals can just reduce our own water usage, but as the public, and Danielle, I'll start with you, what are some recommendations of how the public could be more involved and more engaged in supplier demand for water?
Well, I think, and it's sort of going back maybe a little bit, you know, I was talking about incentives before, we're talking about augmentation, and I think policymakers should be aware of how much money this stuff costs and how expensive it is, because people are going to have to, this is sort of what Arizona is going through right now, you know, you sort of decide what, you know, what water users you want on the system to have water, to have a reliable supply, but it costs money. It costs money to do conservation, it costs money to do augmentation, and it becomes sort of a public policy question and a political question. It's important for lawmakers to be thinking about that proactively, I think. And as we're having discussions about long-term supply and potential augmentations and what the risks are and what the benefits are, and I think that people, you know, if they're not hearing that from their politicians, they should want to be hearing that, because the Colorado River supports, you know, about 40 million people, 6 million acres, I think, of farmland throughout the West. So, you know, everyone sort of has a stake in it.
Colby.
You know, it's a great question of what we can do globally, and I think, you know, what can the collective we do? But when I come back to Southern Nevada, I think, you know, there's a little bit of complacency in what we can do ourselves that has to be addressed first. We do that through a, you know, sort of a four-pronged conservation program: pricing, education, incentives, and regulations. And those things will continue in the future, but anybody you know can drive around this valley and see we're still irrigating strips of grass in front of commercial centers that nobody walks on except the person mowing it. That's really where this community has to start, is getting rid of the wasteful water within the valley.
And I'm gonna throw it over to Bill also. We're talking about grass. Southern California, what are some of the things the public can do?
Yeah, and education, it starts with education. So we went through the worst drought in California's history just a few years ago, and we had the governor had mandatory 25% rationing or cutbacks. Every urban area in the state had to cut back, and every agency had to figure out how to do that. We helped them by offering a turf removal program, $2 a square foot, that some of our member agencies doubled, to try to get the message out that, as Colby said, business as usual doesn't work anymore. And we went through this drought and we cut back use by 30% statewide, yet the economy didn't suffer. We saw that Southern California actually grew. LA has been in a boom the last decade. So we were able to reduce our use with those low-hanging fruit, taking out medians, taking out grass, making small adjustments to your way of life is critical, but it's successful, and you can still maintain a good standard of life, but just make some adjustments along the way.
Pat, we're out of time, but just a couple words. What can the public do?
Obviously, conservation, as Colby said, is imperative. And I think being aware of your water use, but I think there's another mindset change that the public can do. And, you know, programs like this are going to be critically important because I think a level of awareness around water supply is going to be very critical for the public. They have to recognize they have a new form of citizenship. They're not just citizens of this community, of this state, but they're also citizens of a basin. They are glued at the hip with everyone who shares Colorado River water. And it is a shared destiny and a shared responsibility. And I think that mindset of shared responsibility has to begin to set in terms of just being part of an awareness in the community.
Well, very well said. Thank you very much. Thank you all. We really appreciate you being here. And thank you for joining us this week on Nevada Week. For resources discussed on this show or for more information, we encourage you to visit our website. Also, if you have a topic or issue you'd like us to explore on Nevada Week, we'd love to hear from you. So find us on social media or email us at nevadaweek@vegaspbs.org. Thank you again, and I will see you on the next Nevada Week.